Hi, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 6. Okay, so Chapter 6 is going to be the final chapter that we spend really focusing on policing. And I want to look at policing as a subculture because it is a subculture all to itself. It's very much a brotherhood, even though there's plenty of women in there. It's always been referred to as a brotherhood, and now it's the brotherhood and the sisterhood. That it's a very cohesive group of people that are affiliated by the job that they do, by the stresses they undergo that most people can't understand outside of their field. Um, and the fact that they put each other's lives and personal safety and welfare in one another's hands, that there's a lot of responsibility there and there's a lot of trust, or there needs to be a lot of trust from officer to officer, which is part of what creates that subculture. Now, that's an amazing thing, right? Morale and camaraderie is a huge part of policing. It's a great part of a successful police department. However, we don't want that to become so exclusive that if there are problems within the policing subculture, that it's a sort of them against us sort of. It becomes a them against us sort of battle, right? And this is where we start talking about police corruption, because when there is police corruption or there's police abuse of power, it's very, very hard to break that subculture up and get people to discuss or expose their fellow officers, right? Even when their fellow officers have done something really, really inappropriate or really illegal, right? Because the subculture tends to be that powerful. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and we're going to talk about policing subculture as a whole, right? Part of the reason police corruption happens is because they have so much autonomy, right? Policing is a very independent job, and before the advent of body cameras, which is it's not that new in terms of technology, but in terms of mandating it on officers, it's new. And there are still places in the U.S. where it's not mandated. They still don't have body cams, right? But without body cams, policing has largely been an autonomous, independent function, right? You don't have a boss staring over your shoulder. You are expected to be responsible. You are expected to execute your duties largely on your own and largely by the book, right? You also have to remember a couple of things, so it's not bad pay. It's not at all bad pay, but it's not the world's most lucrative job either. And it's a hard job. So not only is it a hard job, but it's a hard job where you're like, oh, people hate me. People are treating me, poorly. I'm doing all this stuff. I'm working shift work and I'm only making, $45,000 a year, right? That tends to open itself up to corruption, right? That people in the field feel not appreciated by the compensation that is applied for the jobs that they do, right? So that's another reason corruption tends to happen. There's also exposure to all sorts of things, right? There's exposure to drugs, to money, to prostitution, right? Nobody's looking when there's no camera. Some people, when nobody's looking, still do exactly what they're supposed to do to the letter of the law, and some people don't. And, when there is no body camera, there's nobody to know, right? Which is why corruption can frequently flourish among policing. And police corruption is simply exercising the power and the authority of the position for personal gain or organizational gain in some cases. So we have internal affairs, which is essentially the people who police the police. That's how I like to refer to them. They're the internal policers, right? They are not wonderfully liked, right, within the police subculture, but they are there to act as a system of checks and balances against this very autonomous, independent method of work, right? So I want to shift gears a little bit here and talk about policing as a job in general. Police get a really, really bad rap, right? These are very hardworking men and women, and there are definitely bad apples out there, and we definitely have to handle them. But the vast majority of people go into policing because they want to help. They want to keep the community safe. They want to help victims. They want to protect people. It's an incredibly high-stress job, right? It's a very, very high-stress job, which can result in a lot of issues that occur both in a police officer's professional and personal existence. And whether it's happening in their personal lives or their professional lives, all of that will bleed into how they execute their duties when they are, or their job responsibilities when they're on duty. So one is shift work, right? Shift work takes, they don't work a 9 to 5 schedule, and the shift work is constantly changing, right? So that puts strain on a marriage. It puts strain on a family because everybody else is in this 9 to 5 regular schedule. And you, the officer, are working, from like 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. You're sleeping when everybody's home. You're working when everybody's asleep. Relationships, it takes a toll on them. It takes a toll on the family and the marriage. Police also work a lot of overtime. So, it's not at all uncommon to hear of officers who are putting in 60-hour weeks. I don't care what job you do, 60 hours is a lot of work. Right? Everybody needs some time to rest and relax. And consistent overtime will really start to eat away at an individual. Part of policing work is working on holidays, right? Criminals don't take a break because it's Thanksgiving. Criminals don't take a break because it's Christmas. So there's another stressor that police experience is, they don't often get to be home to enjoy those, Christmas tree or those holiday rituals. Christmas isn't necessarily Christmas morning. It might not be, Christmas starts at 10 o'clock at night because that's when I get home from my work, right? So that's also a stressor. We've talked about inconsistent schedules, which makes it really difficult to participate in, going to see your kids' sports games, date night out with your spouse. All of those things get really difficult because you've got these wildly inconsistent schedules. You've got stress or shift work. And then even outside of all of that, you have to go to court frequently, right? So your schedule's all over the place. It inhibits life with the family, which causes stress. Divorce is a very common thing among police officers because of all of these reasons, right? Another really, really big one, and this is maybe the one that, I don't know, this one might concern me the most, is sleep deprivation, because officers are working stress or shift work, right? They don't have a regular sleep schedule. Right? They're up all night. They're fueling with coffee all night to stay awake and to stay alert. And you might, work third shift for 2 weeks, and the next week you're right back to the day shift, right? So you have this constant, ever-changing schedule. Your body gets all out of whack. You can't sleep right. You can't sleep normally. And all of a sudden, you're not getting consistent rest. Sleep deprivation is incredibly dangerous in any field. It's just really unhealthy and really bad for anybody, right? You're at a cognitive decline. You are less patient. You are more reactive. You're more emotional. So sleep deprivation is very common among officers, and it is really concerning because they're dealing with very high stress situations on a sleep deprived schedule. Poor diets are another one. All that shift work frequently leads to a lot of fast food intake, stuff that you can just grab on the go. And when you're working 60 hours a week, well, all of a sudden every meal you're having is not nutritious and is full of cholesterol and sodium and everything else. Finally, stress management through drug and alcohol abuse. Policing is a very stressful job. It's a very stressful job. Most of the time you're dealing with people who are having the worst day of their lives. And people are not happy to see you, right? And they don't treat you with the respect and the consideration that any human being deserves. And so managing all of that stress, it's not uncommon for officers to turn to alcohol or substance abuse as a way to take off the edge. When you marry all of these things, the shift work, the sleep deprivation, the bad diet, the self-medicating, the stress on the families, and you marry all of that together with the career, it's a lot. I mean, that's a lot for any given person to do day in and day out for a career, which typically is 20 to 25 years, and to not burn out and to not become jaded. It's very easy for that to happen, I think, for anybody who undergoes this circumstance for 20 or 25 years. So what do we do with our officers who are under stress? Because our officers under stress are more likely to engage in abuses of power. They're more likely to misuse use of force in some capacity because they have a shorter temper. They are sleep deprived. They're not operating on a calm, well-rested mind with a body that's full of nutrients. They've got a body full of coffee and McDonald's. What do we do? What do we do about managing the stress, right? So that they can perform their job better. So one of the first things we want to say is to minimize stress. So better diets. Maybe gentlemen and ladies, start packing your lunch, something with actual nutrients, something that's not processed, etc. Stay away from the fast food. Exercise, right? It's a stress reliever. It's good for the physical body, etc. Try to get adequate sleep, right? Getting adequate sleep is really important. Verbal venting, right? Don't hold it in, right? Officers see some of the worst that humanity has to offer, and they don't just see it once, they see it many times. And just internalizing that, never talking about it, never talking about the fact that it's hard on you, it's upsetting, it's stressful, how it makes you feel, just talking about it helps relieve some of that stress. Um, Meditation and yoga. I know that's so not police officer like, but it does make a world of difference in terms of being able to manage stress in anybody's life, right? We are very, very busy as a culture. It's very rare that we just sit down and be still and be quiet and calm our thoughts. And to do so consistently is a very healthy coping mechanism for stress. I often liken this to the fact that firemen often have like their fireman officer lounges where when they're not fighting fires, they go there to decompress. They can take a nap, and then get something to eat. Um, why don't police officers have the same option? Right? Certainly they have just as much, if not more stress. Why don't they have a place where they can go to decompress? Right? Jumping back to officers who self-medicate with their stress with alcohol and drugs. What do we do here? What do we do with an officer who manages stress using illegal drugs? Well, that's a problem, right? First of all, you're breaking the law as an officer doing that. And second of all, you probably arrested people for doing the exact same thing. However, drug abuse and alcohol abuse is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? So you cannot outright fire an officer for having an addiction problem. So we need to destigmatize the fact that it's not an unheard of, uncommon thing, and we need to make treatment and rehabilitation more of an option for officers. Also want you to keep in mind that since 9/11, the role of the officer changed, right? So in terms of massive catastrophes, terrorism, terrorist attacks, often in terms of natural disasters, police are our first responders, right? I mean, you don't call the Department of Homeland Security when somebody blows up a building. The first thing everybody calls is 911, and the first people to get there are going to be police officers. So we get back to the fact that, officers too can experience post-traumatic stress disorder, just like the military. Officers undergo a lot of stress, and we need to find outlets for how they can manage it in a healthy capacity for their own well-being and also for the execution of their job duties. A healthy, well-rested, calmer police officer is who I would rather deal with when they're pulling me over if I'm speeding or whatever else than the opposite, right? And I'm pretty sure everybody would agree with that. Right. So we want to make sure our officers are well rested and taken care of. Right. I want to talk a little bit about qualified immunity. I want you to know that qualified immunity is the protection that's given to government workers, including police, that they cannot be personally sued so long as they have not clearly violated established constitutional law in pursuit of their duties. So this is why people sue the agency and not the officer, right? That when an officer has behaved in violation of constitutional rights, it's the agency that employs the officer that has to pay the civil liability. The reason we have qualified immunity, first and foremost, is if we didn't have it, who would ever become a police officer? Who would ever become an officer if you know that you can be sued personally at any time for anything? If that were on the table, if that were an option, every officer in the United States would constantly be in court defending a civil lawsuit, right? In addition to the fact that it would deter people from taking the job, because who would want to risk your house, your savings, your income, etc., for something that happened on the job when you know it's highly likely that somebody will be suing you for it? So we provide our officers with qualified immunity. Now, this doesn't mean that they can go out and like kill people randomly, right? This isn't a get out of jail free card. They still have to follow the law. And if they violate someone's constitutional rights, like by killing somebody, illegally seizing their life, then you're not covered by qualified immunity, right? So it's a very dicey thing. There's been a lot of talk about the role of qualified immunity in policing. I think it has a very important role. And this has come up a lot with talk of use of force. Is use of force too easily used? Is use of force used inappropriately? Is the training adequate for use of force? Should less than lethal use of force be taught? There's a lot of questions that surround that, right? There's a lot of questions that surround that. The best thing that you can do with use of force is, always adequate training, but also introducing diversity into law enforcement, right? Diversity into law enforcement so that there's never a question of inappropriate use of force on the basis of race, right? So introducing minorities that represent the community that they're policing, introducing women, etc. All right, I'll see you guys in chapter 7.